welcome to the EnergyWorld.com Energy Transition Summit, a joint initiative of the Economic Times and CarbonCopy. I'm Annie Fatima, your host for the day. India's energy transition will be driven by the immediate realization for a clean and green environment set on the back of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, sowing the seeds of a new energy system that is based on energy access, energy security, and affordable power for all. This is a transition where the traditional heavy weights of India's energy basket, both coal and oil, will be gradually replaced with cleaner options, including solar, wind, gas, and biomass, apart from the rise of the new technologies like e-mobility, floating solar, offshore wind, and hydrogen. However, this historic opportunity to clean the energy system comes with its challenges. Green energy has to be reliable, grid safe, and affordable. The EnergyWorld Energy Transition Summit aims to provide a one-of-its-kind platform for energy sector stakeholders, both global and domestic decision makers, CEO and researchers, to thrash out a roadmap for this mega transition in the energy landscape, which will have profound implications for livelihoods, job creation, environment, and sustainability. This virtual summit is a collaborative effort supported by an ecosystem of partners, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our presenting partner, CarbonCopy. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to see your participation on social media as well, so keep sharing your views using the hashtag #ETEnergyWorld. Now, without much ado, I would like to invite Aarti Khosla, Director, Climate Trends, publisher CarbonCopy, to start the panel discussion on the topic, Future for Coal in India. Over to you, Ms. Khosla.
Thank you very much, Annie, and thanks as well to the Economic Times team for bringing this very important session together. Good morning, everyone. Morning to all the participants who have tuned in to listen to this, and a very warm welcome to our esteemed panel. The objective of today's session, as Annie described, is to find some kind of an intersection between what India's energy transition demands are while looking at the current status of coal, which is a completely complex ecosystem, but at the same time trying to see what does it mean in terms of India's economic growth going forward, jobs, and various other intersections on the social, economic, and the political economy of coal. We have a stellar panel amongst us. We have 1 hour to have this conversation. And without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists to you one by one. We have Mr. Partha Bhattacharya, who needs no introduction here to this group, has been the former chairman of Coal India Limited, also the author of a book very aptly titled When Coal Turned Coal, and famously the architect of the Coal India Limited IPO ban. Welcome to you, Mr. Bhattacharya. We also have Mr. Govind Shankar Narayanan. Govind is the co-founder and CEO of EQ Climate Finance, which is India's first ESG fund, and has held various senior positions, including co-founding Tata Capital. Welcome to you as well, Govind. We have Rahul Tongia, who's a senior fellow at Brookings and now called Center for Social and Economic Progress, and has been a scholar on India's energy economy and has studied coal like no one else has. Very welcome to you, Rahul Tongia. We have two Rahuls. We have Rahul Prityani, who has been studying markets and industry in India, as is the Director of Industry and Customized Research at CRISIL. Welcome to you, Rahul. And we have Tim Buckley, who's joining us from Sydney, a director at the Institute of Energy Finance and Analysis, AIFA, and has been analyzing the energy economy of many countries, including India. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. And may I please request all the panelists to also open their cameras at this moment. Well, like I said, we have less time, but at the same time, I think we all know that coal has been so fundamental and central to India's energy mix that there is an enormous need to balance at this point the considerations of an energy transition. And while it's pretty obvious that the transition is going to be inevitable, decisions that get taken now must be based not just on economics, as experts like you have said, but also on other factors on the social side, the considerations on whether the the transition itself is responsible versus irresponsible, and what are the factors that will play a key role. And to that effect, even as COVID has assailed, there has been good news coming on the renewables front. Renewables themselves have seen massive efficiency gains, deflationary pricing, imports of coal declining, and it just seems that at a time when the COVID recovery itself is a matter of concern, coal in and of itself also won't disappear from the energy mix, but at the same time, something which is very fundamental will happen, and possibly the writing of the on the wall in terms of how renewable expansion is looking might provide a cue to all of these complex questions, which I want the panelists to now tackle. The way we will go is that I will invite each one of you to share your initial thoughts. We would keep that to 7 minutes, maximum 8 minutes, and then we will try and include some of the discussion points, which questions that the participants might have, and try and wrap it in the given time. And first of all, given the pros and cons, Mr. Bhattacharya, given how finding a middle ground will not be easy, but yet must be done, given also all your understanding of coal's historic role, may I invite you to share your thoughts on what do you think coal demand is going to look like? Is there a demand peak that will happen, which is round the corner? And apologies for clubbing questions, but I also want your views on, the COVID economic recovery package had coal auctions as a big part of the announcement and the government's initiative, and the response there has not been very overwhelming, but it's going on in terms of how some of the mines haven't received bids even. So I wanted to just stop at this moment and invite you to please share your views on all of this.
So thanks, Arati, and thanks, E.T., for organizing this exchange of thoughts on a subject of great relevance, and for providing me this opportunity to share my views. You see, coal today accounts for a little over 50% of total commercial energy and over 70% of the power that is generated in this country. So obviously, the transition to renewables, while it will definitely happen, but it is not going to happen overnight. It will take a while. The question is how to manage this transition. As the famous book edited by Rahul Tongia and his team describes the title, Future of Coal in India, whether it is bumpy or seamless. So that will depend upon how the whole thing is managed. Now, the transition in the energy basket from fossil fuels to renewables has moved out of the drawing board into the ground quite a few years back, and is now gaining momentum at an accelerated pace. The widely shared concern of containing global warming has triggered policy initiatives in most parts of the world to hasten the transition. The process has taken deeper roots in the advanced economies and has also made a substantial entry into India and China, the two large Asian economies that depend substantially on fossil fuels. The transition in India will need to consider a few boundary conditions. First, the per capita consumption of electricity in this country is only 1100 units, which is close to a third of China or a third of the world average. This needs to at least double at a fast pace to enable India catch up with the rest of the world in terms of quality of life. Around 300 million people are reportedly not having access to electricity. Providing such access ASAP is an important inclusive development agenda, commonly referred to as Power for All 24/7. On considerations of the relatively low per capita income of this country, it is also crucial that affordability of power remains a key policy parameter. The imperative for faster growth of generation and distribution of power distinguishes India from most other countries. See, replacing fossil fuel driven power by renewable in a situation where overall energy requirement is fast growing is far more complex and challenging as compared to a situation where such growth is marginal or muted. Among fossil fuels, it is only coal that is available in abundance, the aggregate resources being of the order of 300 plus billion tons, whereas the current consumption is close to 1 billion ton. Now, coming to the competitive cost of coal-based power versus renewable, two policy prescriptions, namely the GST compensation cess on coal and the capital subsidies available for renewable power, has created a situation where a new coal-based capacity is unlikely to deliver power any cheaper than renewable power. Hence, new capacity of coal-based power beyond those in the pipeline are unlikely to come. The relatively high railway freight on coal will further dampen possibilities of setting up new capacities away from coal fields. Nevertheless, the silver lining is the existing thermal power plants, the existing ones, which are operating at a low PLF of around 55% and are capable of generating substantially more power that entails only the variable cost of coal. The cost of this incremental power is substantially lesser than renewable power. So creating conditions to utilize the existing capacity to the maximum is therefore in the best interest of generating power with affordability. A major impediment to this strategy is the financial distress of the DISCOMs. The policy adopted by most states to get the DISCOMs provide subsidized power to the farm sector without making commensurate budgetary support available to them, and the high T&D losses have been the contributing factors to such financial distress. Stimulus packages of increasing doses injected from time to time has provided only temporary respite. Sooner than later, a recurring financial support to targeted consumers on the lines of direct benefit transfer will only be necessary to allow the DISCOMs charge market rates to all consumers, and this, coupled with strong administrative intervention to minimize T&D losses, shall strengthen the DISCOMs over a period of time. As DISCOMs regain financial health and are allowed to further consolidate by buying and selling power at market-determined rates, the generation and offtake of power is expected to grow faster. This should trigger a sustained rise of PLF of existing thermal power plants to maximum possible levels and infuse large complement of low-cost thermal power into the system. Now, the highest average PLF seen so far was 79% in 2007-8. The power capacities added since then are with better technology. Also, some inefficient capacities aggregating to around 10 gigawatt has been taken out of the system. As a result, the maximum annual average PLF can be a few percentage points higher than the best seen 79% in 2007. So if we consider the rising PLF of existing plants from 55% at present to say a maximum, theoretical maximum of 85%, will generate around 400 billion units of electricity at the cheapest cost by consuming additional coal of 250 million tons per annum. This will take the current consumption of coal from 1 billion ton to around 1.25 billion ton in a few years' time. The demand for coal beyond this level will not come from power sector, but from alternative use of coal as feedstock for gasification, to syngas, for manufacture of steel in the DRI route, or for manufacture of chemicals and fertilizers. A consequence of the aforesaid strategy is also to impart greater capability of the new GenCos to service staggering bank debts tied up to generation of thermal power. The situation can also help the stranded thermal power assets to reorganize and come into operation in course of time. This can mitigate the deployment of budgetary resources for recapitalization of banks, particularly the PSU banks. On the other hand, the growth of renewables powered by R&D, innovation, and consequent cost reduction is likely to intensify. A situation where the unsubsidized tariff of renewable power, including cost of storage, compares favorably with the marginal cost of power generation from existing thermal plants cannot be ruled out, at least in the distant future. Once this happens, economics coupled with clean energy imperatives will witness a rapid decline of coal usage in power generation and faster advent of renewable power. As it stands today, this looks at least 2 decades away. Till then, it is necessary for coal to find its due place in the energy discourse. First, best practices in mining, environment management, social sustainability, etc. must continue to be pursued with vigor. Coming to the last point of auctions. See, as we all see, this auction has come actually 15 years too late. And as a result, our expectation that international mining companies will come and join the auction has proved to be futile. Internationally, thermal coal is out. Particularly financing for thermal coal is out. So therefore, international companies coming here is out of question. We have to rely only on the domestic players mostly. And again, domestic players also have their ifs and buts. They are unlikely to go for unexplored or underexplored blocks. And that is the reason 15 out of 38 blocks didn't receive too much of attention. But to some extent, I think the response was mixed. It's not a completely washout, but it is not a great response. It is mixed. In some form or other, I do expect that auction will come. I mean, auction mines will come into operation. maybe 3 years down the line. And that will make the scenario a little more competitive for Coal India.
Thanks, Mr. Bhattacharya. As expected, you wrapped everything around in your time. I think there were two things that you said on how, the international sentiment is different, but domestically we will still have a chance to induct cheaper coal into the system. And maybe we come back to it a little bit later on how one balances the concerns of cost and economics versus social and other aspects. But at this point, I want to ask you, Govind, there has been a sharpened focus on environmental, social, governance issues across the world. Mr. Bhattacharya also mentioned just now, international financing is out. Domestically, we are still looking at expanding existing. What do you feel, especially vis-a-vis the shift in strategy of shareholders across the world who are concerned about the impact of climate change, which is becoming a big driver to mount pressure, and big institutions are restricting portfolios to move away from coal? How does all of that stack up?
Yeah, so Aarti, thank you, and thank you, ET and CarbonCopy, for having me on this panel. I think Mr. Bhattacharya covered this, very, very comprehensively, but I will try to address your question from a financial perspective. Clearly, over the last few years, there has been an enhanced focus on climate and more generally on what is called ESG, which is environment, social, and governance issues. This is now beginning to take shape through significant regulatory intervention. So the European Union, for instance, has defined through a taxonomy of some sort what they feel is a genuine ESG activity and what they sort of quaintly call is greenwashing. So they are specifically telling people, especially fund managers and investors, that look, you need to very clearly fall in line with our taxonomy when it comes to making your investments. They are not prohibiting investments of any sort, but effectively they are asking managers to sort of present to their fiduciaries, who might be trustees and so on, what kind of investments they are making. That puts pressure on fund managers, obviously, because nobody wants to be seen to be investing behind either climate unfriendly or socially unfriendly activities. And coal is clearly seen to be climate unfriendly in that sense from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. This is now seeing its impact in pension funds, etc., because the trustees of these pension funds now are under pressure to take action. There are many instances. The sort of Cambridge University pension fund has, come under flack for this. A number of others have been questioned as to why they continue to have investments. In India itself, we are aware that even Coal India was questioned by some investors. So, this particular issue sort of remains. Next question really is, what actually is the effect of these kind of regulations taking that are happening, and why is it happening? I think from the perspective of climate change, obviously there is a general purpose worry that people have got. But there is also a very real financial concern. I think the concern really is that in the not very long term, demand for coal itself is likely to go down. There is also enough pressure on coal-intensive industries like steel, cement, etc., to find alternatives for some of this. They cannot find alternatives for everything, but certainly there is some pressure on those industries. So there is a general sense that coal and more generally, fossil fuels will be demanded less. And therefore, companies which are in that space will not make necessarily very good investments. If you look at the sort of pure sort of financial aspect of it, many people have made predictions also, which are, whether one cannot say whether it's accurate or not, but they have said that the market value of coal industry, coal-based industries will decline by 4 to 5% per year. So if you compound that over 8 or 10 years, it is a significant decline. The question to ask is, if you are a fiduciary of investing other people's money, particularly pension money and so on, and you know this, what step can you take? And therefore, inevitably, one of the steps tends to be to discourage investments in coal, because if you don't do it and if you lose a lot of money, there will be a pressure that you could, in some of these countries, even be sued, because people will say that you knew full well that coal assets will get stranded and so on, and you still did nothing. Which is why you would have seen that, let's say, the Norwegian pension fund has exited it. The German government has provided, a lot of money for a transition completely away from coal by 2038. And individual companies like Rio Tinto and others have been sort of selling many of their coal assets. So these are the actions that you are seeing, and the rationale, I think I explained very briefly. One challenge, obviously, for financial companies in this area is, sort of excluding coal from an investment list is not very difficult, that if you happen to be a coal mining entity. But there are also many entities which are not directly related to coal, but which are significant utilizers. So I think the intent is to reduce the demand side as well. Now, usually, the question that tends to be asked is how, as a thumb rule, if 20 to 30% of your business happens to be dependent on coal or based on coal in some way, then that tends to be a sort of a rough guide saying that, look, these are industries we should not invest behind. Coming to ESG itself specifically, which is a larger sort of ambit which covers both governance and social issues, there is now, I think, an abundance of evidence that investing behind companies which are good on ESG is generally a good thing. So it is almost a proxy for good management. So professors like George Serafeim at Harvard and others have done, extensive studies showing that, funds which are ESG based are, outperform by 3-4% every year and all. As a result of this, you are beginning to find that even many indices that, the exchange traded funds tend to follow are now excluding ESG unfriendly companies in general, and to some extent, coal is obviously a most extreme case of that. So coal companies tend to get excluded in toto from some of these indices. So in a nutshell, the amount of financing that coal and the coal industry is likely to get from outside India, at least, is likely to be extremely low, I think, except for the odd bilateral arrangement that the government might be able to. It is becoming increasingly difficult for entities to sort of support any sort of, climate unfriendly activity. So
May I at this point, Govind, bring Rahul Pratyani, and we can come back to what you're saying, but I picked, the point that you said about industry as well needs to find alternatives. And, lately we have seen, Rahul, there are companies like Tata Power, JSW and others, even some of the states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, which have announced that they don't want to expand further into coal. So where do you think the additional capacity will come from, and how is that going to look vis-a-vis what, Mr. Bhattacharya and Govind have just, explained?
Good morning to all the listeners, and good morning to the panelists, Aarti. See, as far as the coal demand scenario is concerned, and I think you spoke about, many of the private sector players, how they are positioned. If one looks at the overall perspective, I think we, over the last few years in India, are facing a much larger issue with respect to, power demand itself being relatively low. And this is primarily driven by, a lot of energy efficiency initiatives that are happening at various levels, especially on the demand side. I think we have seen enough and more, improvement on energy efficiency. And on the margin, the way we expected around 10 years back, the demand will grow. Probably that has not really kept up pace. Simultaneously, we have had this key change in perspective, where I think renewables have had a very prominent role to play. The government, coming to the fore and setting up, strong targets, and rightfully so. Plus, in the environment on the private sector side, I think what we have seen is most of the private sector plants that came up post 2009, 9 to 14 kind of period, barring a few, many of them have struggled to get demand on board. And the economics clearly for many of those plants have suffered. And we all know, with respect to the banking sector, I think what are the kind of problems that they are facing with respect to NPAs. And even after, them willing to take certain haircuts on the exposure, the willingness of anybody to buy those plants has been quite challenged. And I think we've seen enough evidences with very few assets getting resolved. And it's been a very strong and arduous process. So as a result, the environment, especially from a funding standpoint in this sector, has become quite challenging. And consequently, you are in a scenario where the private sector players, clearly, this is not a preferred mode to kind of, add capacity. And even going forward, as Mr. Bhattacharya mentioned, you're currently operating at 55% utilization rates for thermal power plants. I'm taking into account that this is a COVID year, but even if things were to improve, and given the way the demand from a demand standpoint, how things evolve, and also one needs to keep in mind, the renewable energy sector enjoys a must-run status. So the ramp up, there seems to be enough headroom that might be available, even if one takes into account any kind of, shutdowns for some of the older plants. There is a good runway where, your existing capacities itself can service future demand. So in that context, I think fresh capacity addition looks fairly challenging. Maybe it may happen in few cases, but I think it will be primarily driven by the public sector or the state sector, who will kind of, add capacity, and they will not be very large. And clearly, all the public sector entities also have shown significant interest to go for, renewable energy. That coupled with the pricing scenario in terms of cost competitiveness, given the kind of benefits that are available for the renewable energy sector and how the pricing has declined, and compare that with thermal and the complexities of execution, I think given that backdrop, it looks fairly challenging for fresh capacity addition at least from the private sector. Maybe on the state sector, on the margin, you may see some kind of, additions that will come about. But looks very unlikely given the global backdrop the way it is, given the financing environment the way it is, and also as my co-panelists mentioned, given the kind of scenario globally where you've seen greater focus on environment in the funding consideration, I think this backdrop is one thing which will ensure that the growth may be very tepid. And the way we are looking at things over the next few years, we are looking at maybe 2 to 4% kind of growth on the demand side, on the thermal coal side. Maybe some of the sectors other than power, probably they can grow a little bit faster, assuming manufacturing takes off, or you have greater reliance on Atmanirbhar, and plus also some captive mines will get ramped up. I think all those will provide opportunities. But on a larger piece, I think a reasonably strong growth and a financing environment which will attract private sector capital for thermal assets looks very unlikely at the current stage.
Got it, Rahul. I think what stood out was what you said, that new coal capacity could really be on the margins, and that mainly still by the public sector, while private sector will find its own benefits of renewables, and the complexities of thermal might just be too much of a dampener for them. Tim, you have analyzed a lot of India's energy system, but at the same time, you've also recently written a lot about how renewables are going to surge ahead. The deflationary pricing is there already, but at the same time, there is a lot of historical baggage of coal, but it's clear that India now has among the highest renewable targets of any country. And how much can we discount that scenario where such targets would not be achieved? I mean, we are looking at 450 gigawatt by 2030, and that's huge in comparison to any other country. How do you think, all of this really looks in terms of where the country should be going, and what are your views vis-a-vis renewables and coal, and the challenge of how coal will look in the decade or so?
Certainly. Thank you, Arti, for that question. And I certainly view India as very much a world leader with that 450 gigawatts target. Obviously, we've seen no growth, in fact, negative electricity growth in the last 2 years. So I think we need to scale back the total demand picture and at the same time scale back the renewable energy target to reflect that. But the share that renewables will have in India, the share gain, I think is going to be critical, and it makes India an absolute world leader. And so maybe taking a step back from that, I think that's a good entree. My focus of comments, I might just touch on some global trends that are the backdrop to investing in coal in India. So this month, I think we've seen two what will prove to be absolutely globally critical announcements, both on climate. So China's net zero before 2060 is a major line in the sand, a major lift in China's ambition and ask. It's then been married this week by Japan coming out with a net zero by 2050 commitment. And that's obviously in the context that we've got next year COP26 coming up. And so I see a very optimistic scenario, depending on how the American elections go, where China's lifting its ambition, Japan's lifting its ambition, Europe's lifting its ambition, India is already a world leader with its ambition of 450 gigawatts. So all of a sudden, 4/5 of the most important countries in the world are lifting their ambition to align with the Paris Agreement. So I know climate is critically important, that we understand common but differentiated responsibilities, but I see India on the center stage of the world, and all of a sudden China and Japan are edging onto that center stage in alliance with India, in alliance with Europe, and maybe, depending on the presidential elections, in alliance with America, and under depending on the elections pan out. But that could be a very powerful impetus that means 2020 is a profoundly important year, but 2021 could be equally important. And that just highlights the magnitude of change that is hitting energy markets globally. Now, getting down to the corporate level, I might mention just in the last couple of months, last couple of weeks, some corporate announcements that are profound in the Asian market. So JERA of Japan, the biggest thermal power generator in Japan, Australia's single biggest customer in the world for thermal power, has just announced that they will close all of their supercritical coal plants in Japan by 2030. That's then matched by KEPCO, which is, again, one of the biggest power companies in Asia. It's Australia's second biggest customer of all thermal power in the world, and KEPCO of South Korea has just announced that they will build no new coal plants. So I know India is different to Asia and to the OECD countries like South Korea and Japan and China and Australia, but the backdrop is that global markets are moving at a rate that no one could have predicted at the start of this year. And on top of that, we've seen financial institutions, starting with BlackRock this year in January, committing to a global redefining of finance. But we've now seen 56 globally significant financial institutions upgrade or enhance their coal exit policies. So that's a key point that Govind talked about. We've got to look at India in the context of its reliance and access to global capital. India has almost unlimited access to capital for renewable energy, but the capital markets globally are closing before our eyes for coal. So I think we've got to have that context. Now, moving in the last couple of minutes on India, I think COVID-19's changed everything for the world and for India. It's worth bearing in mind, though, when we look at some numbers, and I'll just reference here CarbonCopy's electricity dashboard, in the first half of this fiscal year, Indian electricity demand dropped 11%. Coal power dropped 16%. If I rephrase that, what we have seen in the first half of fiscal 2021 is that coal power wore 100% of the demand destruction from COVID in India. That means we've referenced, a number of the speakers have referenced 55% utilisation rates, but in the first half of fiscal 2021, utilisation rates were actually 45% for coal. And there is not a coal plant in the world that can sustain a 45% utilisation rate. And that's why, again, a number of the speakers have mentioned it, but the IEA just put out their World Energy Outlook 2020, and they curtailed their their projections of capacity growth for India by 86%. For capacity growth in India of new coal plants by 2040, they've reduced their expectations by 86% in just 12 months. So the whole landscape is shifting. At the end of the day, I'll conclude by saying, look, we know that renewables improve India's energy security, they reduce pollution, they are very deflationary, they leverage domestic resources, investment and employment, and the financial markets are really driving that home. We've seen Azure Power up 100% year to date. We've seen Adani Green up 300%. And against that, Coal India is down 50%. So the financial markets are talking. They're looking forward and they're looking at who's going to win this race. And the answer is inevitably renewables. And we need to have an orderly transition. And I think that means over the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see renewables take almost 100% of all the growth in new incremental energy needs for India. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Very important point about when a conservative organization like IEA says that solar prices are the lowest ever in the history. And, as a generalist who does not understand the details of the power market, that really stuck out coming from IEA a couple of days back. But also a few other things you said worth coming back again. But, in the interest of time, I will quickly like to invite Rahul Tongia. And Rahul, of course, you have written a book, Mr. Bhattacharya started his talk by mentioning about your book, and it talks about everything. But given what the other panelists have spoken, it seems like there is a need to manage India's win globally and do that in the next couple of years, but at the same time manage domestically as well some of the concerns, both on the economic side but as well as on the social side when you're looking at things like transition, the interdependencies on sectors like railways, which you speak very eloquently about, but also, the building movement and campaign on how air quality in a lot of cities get impacted by coal power plants and, the dilution and delay of norms there. I know I'm packing in a lot. I'll let you choose what you want to pick from there, but I think it will be good to get some steer on how do you think managing this win domestically and internationally works in the context of India?
Thank you, Aarti. We at CSET, Center for Social and Economic Progress, have a book called The Future of Coal in India. And there's a blog that actually has a lot of data and insights summarized. So I invite everyone, it's available. I think that's the key issue, is this transition. We have to look at the fundamentals, because there's a lot of average numbers that people talk about, and they're not sufficient to understand the trends that may happen going forward on its own. I'll come to that in just a second. The other sort of key point is there's not just a transition towards decarbonization, but there are other transitions the energy system is looking at. You have changes in pricing. You look at what's happened with diesel over the years. You have market-based systems for procurement of power, which is the push for electricity. So in some ways, people want to, but haven't figured out how to go away from power purchase agreements. Another major shift, which is of direct relevance to coal, is there was a huge increase in coal-based capacity between 2011 and 2016. So in 5 years, you added at a CAGR of 14.5%, while demand grew only about 6.5%, 7% in that period. So that is the reason the coal PLFs have fallen. It is not RE per se. RE also grew, of course, but nowhere near what this did. So managing this. So one of the biggest shifts that energy policy hasn't quite figured out is the old answer to everything was more. What do I need? More. Now we're at a stage of managing in a portfolio manner renewables, coal, all of the above. And that shift is probably one of the biggest shifts that India needs to figure out. A second major part of this, and I'm sort of jumping to my punchline, is the transition is not about the rupees per kilowatt hour per se. It's about winners and losers. And the winners and losers differ by location, by ownership, by old and new, public and private. And so these sorts of issues are very key when we look at power plants. So when everyone says that the PLF in India has fallen, it's come back up since the COVID fall to some extent. If the average in India is, I'm making up a number, it used to be 60%. That 60% was all actually a bunch of 40s and a bunch of 80s. So you had a huge locational spread that really matters. So I think the key question, and I agree with Tim and many others, the incremental growth is heavily coming out of RE. But that doesn't mean coal is dead, because you can utilize, as Partho said, the existing power plants with a higher PLF relatively easily. And there is slack. So the key date to me is not 2021 or this time period, but the mid-2020s. That is when 3 or 4 things are going to happen, is when India is going to need to make some hard choices or figure things out. First, this so-called surplus coal capacity will disappear. Demand is still growing, and renewables without a battery are not able to meet the evening peak. Second, renewables, you have, let's use the 175 gigawatts as a straw man target. That can be absorbed relatively easily in the existing system without major storage and without huge shifts to operations or pricing. But after a point, in a few years, you will need to change, because the current system is all, let's just add the RE and then it'll displace coal. So that is one thing that does happen in the middle of the day. The older model of renewables versus coal was coal is getting expensive, renewables are getting cheaper, they cross over in the middle, and that is grid parity, and then RE wins. A more nuanced view of that takes into account 2 or 3 other factors. The first is average cost versus marginal cost. This is key because, as Mr. Bhattacharya started with, we have a lot of coal capacity that's underutilized. So the marginal cost of coal is something that states look at compared to the average cost of renewables, because renewables have no fuel cost. Then you have a locational spread. The marginal cost of coal varies heavily by location. Pithead is cheap, far away is expensive. So in Punjab, because of the so-called, you can call it a tax, where coal overpays for paying for passengers on railways. Every kilowatt hour of coal generation, 2017 numbers, was 60 paise per kilowatt hour for passengers on railways. So that spread means you have to think of it not like a crossover, but steps of a ladder. And so it's easy to say don't build a new coal plant. It's a no-brainer. Now the question is, will you be able to not run an existing plant? Depends on the marginal cost. But even that is only for variable renewable energy, VRE, which means no battery, take it when you can. So you still need something else for many other parts of the year. And that something else in India defaults to coal because we don't have cheap gas and hydro has growth limitations. Now, battery technology is improving. It's nowhere near there yet. We have quantification of some of these trends in the books and chapters. So what is likely to happen, the good news is RE can grow a little bit without needing a battery. There's still headroom. At some point, though, we'll have to rethink how we do our portfolio. So if folks are interested, we run a carbontracker.in, which is a website which tracks, not carbontracker.org, time of day based generation by source all India, real time with analytics. So that's our website that shows these data. And that really tells you that at the peak of the year, the RE contribution was 3% because it's an evening peak. So what was much of the rest of it? Coal. And hydro to some extent, which is running as a peaker. So the last sort of point, how we move in towards this transition, is we need to figure out instruments that help us clean up our coal instead of just wishing it away. This includes the financing of the cleaning up of the thermal power plants instead of delaying it. If you need to shut down some older and dirtier plants, fine. But then on the flip side, if need be, we should be able to consider finishing up brand new coal plants that are already under construction. Because one of the things that strikes you as, doesn't make sense. You have brand new coal power plants which are very efficient. Efficiency is the best part of cleanliness. And yet these are not running as much. Their PLF is low. This is because of structural distortions in the system. We need to solve these. So at one end, we've got a macro trajectory of coal plateauing. It's not going away in India, but the growth rate slows down. Then you'll plateau before we can talk about getting rid of coal. But for whatever coal we need, it should be as clean as possible and as secure as possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. Again, I'm also trying to see what each one of you have said, and we would want to come back to some of that very quickly. And you started by talking about this whole fundamental shift in the thinking, where it is not just about more coal or more renewable, but how do we manage the portfolio? And I think for some of us, it's really then about looking at it a little more agnostically and just thinking how the portfolio will look like, rather than, thinking about it very religiously on whether we are just, anti-coal or pro-renewables, and really, that image or that thought needs to be shed to some extent to be able to pick up all the, the relevant questions. And I'm also seeing from the participants, there are a few questions. We have 15 minutes. I wanted to do the following. I wanted to just pick up few things that you all said and allow everybody to come at least for a minute or so, and then have 5 minutes also to address some of the specific questions which are there from participants, mostly on things like the feasibility of renewables, the issue of base load, also on FGD norm dilution and as such. So while, I talk about other things, please also keep in mind to think of those questions, and we will come back to it in the last 5 minutes. But just to address this whole question on, we started by trying to answer whether or not we are looking at a coal peak, how is it looking, and we went into a plethora of discussion. really, looking at all of what you all have said. And I think what I understand is, it's very clear that the PLF can be locational, but, there were news stories in the middle of COVID and early in the lockdown which said 44% PLF. And I know, Mr. Bhattacharya, you said in the beginning that we would want existing coal plants to also supply and maybe ramp up the PLF all the way up to 75 or 80%. So just, a very simple question there, that if existing plants are operating at that low a PLF, how much more can we push them to generate, coal power at say 70 or 80% PLF? Also, given all the various scenarios and analysis on how power demand itself might not come back after COVID and is looking at a drop of say 7 to 16%, depending on what various think tanks are saying about it. How, for a non-specialist audience, how does that simplify?
As I have mentioned, that today the PLF average is about 55%, and I completely agree with Rahul when he says that this average is composed of two components. One which are quite low PLF, another set which is reasonably high PLF. Those at the reasonably high PLF of maybe 70, taking them to 80 is an easier job than addressing this issue of the power stations where the PLF is quite low. One reason why the PLF could be low is the very high coal cost due to high transport costs. Like, for example, South India, Gujarat, or places like that. I think the transport cost itself is the major component of landed cost, which makes the marginal cost of power generation from coal comparable to renewable. Those could be the situations. There, even if the plant capacity allows expansion, the expansion will not take place because of economic reasons. But where the power station is relatively closer to pitheads, the large number of NTPC power plants, or so many other power plants which are closer to pitheads, where the coal cost is reasonable, the landed cost is lower because the transportation cost is lower. There, I believe the expansion of PLF and the plants are good, fresh, new. If the demand can be created, if the DISCOMs are in a position to buy power, that's another problem. The DISCOMs' readiness to buy power. If that can happen, then definitely the PLF in those plants can go up, and correspondingly the coal demand will go up. Broadly speaking, I feel that the current consumption of 1 billion tons should be growing, maybe not to 1.25, but maybe around 1.1, 1.15 or 1.2 at the max from the power sector, and then it depends upon whether other demands come up. So maybe 1.3 could be a sort of a peak, and then it will stay there for some time and then start again coming down maybe over a period of 25, 30 years. That, of course, I can't say at this point in time. This is likely to be the curve going forward.
Right, and I think that's been the whole thing about, the whole coal economy thing, that it has changed its shape and form more quickly than people expected. And, right now we are looking at 1 billion plus, but maybe in a couple of years, even that will need an amendment simply because of the nature in which renewables have grown. And, like somebody said, it's about keep it in the ground more than dig it out. But I think what I understand is that just because the situation is changing so rapidly and the technology is...
I think we've lost Arti, so maybe I might grab the microphone for a sec while she's reconnecting. The question, I think I totally agree with the overall discussion that we're talking about a plateauing of demand from coal or serviced by coal. I think that's the critical thing that we're now all agreeing on, that it's not going to be a doubling of coal demand. It's not going to be a 50% increase. It's going to be a plateauing. And I think I agree we need to have economic reality, economic capital efficiency come in, but we also need to acknowledge that there are a lot of coal plants, as the Environment Minister said this week. There are probably 60 or 70 coal plants that need to close because they're end of life. They don't have pollution controls. So what that will allow is improved capital efficiency, because that will allow the rest of the coal fleet to actually see a higher utilisation rate. So my takeaway would be that we're actually entering a plateauing of coal demand for India in the power sector over the next 5-10 years, and then that'll give us 5 to 10 years to perfect the battery technologies and the firming technologies. But we ultimately need a price signal for power and on a time of day basis to reward the firming power delivery, because exactly as Rahul said, when the sun goes down, we still need the electricity, and that's when the peak is. So we need a firming time of day price to actually incentivize whatever technology can deliver power in the evening peaks. Back to you, Arti. I think you're back online.
Thanks, Tim, and sorry everybody for having disappeared for a moment. I think what you're saying is really about the technology and the policy improvements that are needed to make sure that renewables continue to stay on path. I'm looking at the chat as well. There are a couple of questions from, I think a lot of questions really from industry experts really asking about the whole issue of reliability of renewables, which I think you just addressed, and whether or not renewables can take the base load. I know, Rahul, you also spoke about it. There is one specific question on FGDs, and some of us who have been watching this space know that there has been a whole discussion on how yesterday a Central Electricity Authority paper basically proposed that places where SOx, NOx, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide levels are low, there is no need to install those pollution control equipment. And really the question is about how do we realize those concerns, on how do we, manage the concerns of global warming, the concerns of our economy, as well as, the harmful effects of pollution that are coming. Rahul, do you want to take this question? It's from Mr. Joseph Charlie and is specifically around the investment on the FGDs.
So I think as far as the investment on the FGD front is concerned, I think what you heard maybe sometime back, maybe a off case, but clearly given the sustenance, I think of existing power producers, they will clearly need to have some of these things in place, because even from a future point of view, the way the stance is going to emerge of the regulators as well as the government, and given that the environmental norms are only going to get more and more constricted, so in order for you to operate, I think this will have to be done, and I think that it is going to get even further more mainstream. We don't see any easy way out, and I think this is something that will happen. And I think there are enough and more people who are willing to fund the same also. And as far as my understanding goes, even the FGD from the funding side will be a little bit more, environmental, society friendly. So to that extent, we don't see concerns for some of the existing plants. It is a must do for, this to really, take off going forward.
Okay, that's quite a line to say, as opposed to what Ministry of Power is then contemplating and the CEA discussion paper proposes. But I guess we will see how this discussion goes on. Clearly, with the troubles of not being able to take a lot of cash out of pocket at this point, it's quite evident that power plants will come out and say that this is not the time where they want to invest in this. And this is not really a discussion about air pollution, but I think the troubles of Indians being exposed to air pollution just keep grabbing headlines, and that has not been stopping. And somewhere it feels that will need to be fixed as well in terms of how India's energy plans are looking vis-a-vis just how much exposure will happen. But coming back to
Arti, can I have a minute on this?
Yes.
30 seconds.
Yeah.
See, while FGD is definitely fine, but one has to also recognize that Indian coal, particularly the domestic coal, is generally low in sulfur. And FGD, what it does is it removes sulfur, the SOx part of it. I think alternatively, we have a technology of coal washing. Washing has its own problems. I mean, washing has been done in a very haphazardly manner earlier. But now we have a couple of washeries coming up which are closed circuit, low water requirement, 10 million ton washeries, 3 of them are coming up in Mahanadi Coalfields. And these are absolutely state of the art. So what it does, this has been tested by a scientist in NIS, the National Institute of Advanced Sciences, one Dr. Srikanth. He has found that this washed coal, actually use of that reduces NOx, reduces P 2.5. Both of these. SOx to a lesser extent. And these washeries come at a 1/10 of the cost of an FGD. So I think we should have a mix where you are using imported coal, high sulfur, you put FGDs. But where you can do with domestic coal of low sulfur, I think insist on washeries. Those are low cost, and those are definitely going to make address the issue of clean coal, which Rahul had flagged. The coal that will come out will be clean, and it will definitely have lesser ash coming out. So I think there should be a mix of all this, not only going for FGD everywhere.
Right, and I think it's that balance on how to operate, which really seems to be missing from the discourse, because there is one camp talking about certainly we need FGDs on all, and there is another CEA paper which talks about it in a different spirit, and I think it's just the middle ground. But
we should have either FGD or coal washing. I mean, either of these. Coal should not be used on a ROM basis. Right. You know, the run-of-mine coal being used, and in this context, the latest circular that coal need not be washed. I don't think that's the right thing to do. That's not the right thing to do. That should be, again, revisited.
Perfect. And, now I'm really conscious of time. We have about 4 minutes. I only wanted to wrap up this panel and maybe, give one final word to everybody if there is still a chance. But let me just attempt to see where we landed with everything that we discussed, right from how the transition won't happen overnight. And I noted what you said, Mr. Bhattacharya, about the fact that the transition itself is is no longer in the drawing board and has moved to the ground a few years back. So I think we all do realize the importance of the writing on the wall, pretty much the fact that the transition is on its path and it's established. Renewables have established themselves. The question really on agnostically being able to look at how it's not just about what more we need, the kind of argument that you made, Rahul Tongia. It's not just about more coal or more solar or more wind, but really about managing the portfolio in a way we have not done it before. And I think that on this point, a couple of important things which Govind mentioned were really about how, the shift in investor sentiment internationally is going to make the whole change and have the trickle down effects to that extent. I mean, of course, with $1,000 billion Norwegian pension fund, if it does anything, it does impact a lot of downstream companies, and those are the kind of things that India will not be able to miss in terms of how the shareholders internationally are looking, and fairly quite a thing to balance in terms of both climate aspirations as well as the energy finance considerations going forward. Rahul Prithyani, I think one of the main things that you said was certainly about how renewables will have a prominent role to play, but also the fact that addition in coal capacity might just come in fringes, and that also from the public sector, and the funding challenge in and of itself will remain, and that's going to be a thing where it's kind of understood that the renewables have their benefit, but the fact that the complexities of thermal also remain, and really again, question of how the tightrope walk will happen going forward. Jim, you were quite clear on bringing the whole idea of the Paris Agreement, which actually talks about 1.5, keeping the temperature to that. I think what you said was quite encouraging to the point of China talking about net zero, Europe having talked about net zero, Japan yesterday said net zero. If a US presidential win happens, then I think in spite and despite of COVID, we are looking at a climate ambition across the world, which was completely undreamt of about a couple of weeks back. So, it's pretty much how the change happens overnight. And really, it seems that the sentiment could be a little bit different. But, in wrapping up, Rahul Tongia's take and, a very entrenched take on how the transition is about winners and losers. And I thought that's really important. While on the one hand, India needs to be a winner internationally on climate, I think we are at a point where even domestically we have to be a winner in terms of people and public health and communities also winning as we win on the economy, and as we try and win more on, the whole coal sector trying to retain its jobs, and the transition being something which is kind of justified and done in a way that it does not impact, just does not lead to job losses, simply put. So all in all, let me just quickly pause and ask the panelists if there is any last one line or one word, and I think the last word should really be yours. So I know we can extend by 2 minutes, and I want to take that privilege and still give all of you a quick chance to come in one sentence maximum, and then we will wrap up. Mr. Bhattacharya.
I think Rahul is waiting for a long time. Can you give him the first chance?
Sure. Okay. Sorry. Rahul Tongia.
Just an observation that we have to put transitions in context. and each country's context is different. India's per capita coal consumption on an energy normalized basis is half the world average. And so the worries that the world have on, oh, what is India doing, are slightly misguided, because instead of focusing on quantity, it's also the quality and impact that we need to focus on. So cleaning it up. So instead of people saying, I will not touch coal or invest in coal, I wouldn't mind any investments that help raise the efficiency of existing power plants, because those aren't going away. And efficiency raise is the best way to both cut down carbon and local air pollution. The last sort of quick thought, scale. India and China are two of the biggest economies and energy users in the world. US is another one. But only China is set up to be a net exporter of clean tech to a large extent, on a global scale. And so India still has enough domestic headroom that it can improve its manufacturing and make in India. But if it really wants to talk at a global level as a player, it has a lot more room to grow. And so that's both a half full, half empty sort of.
Yes, Rahul. Efficiency gains a must. Our headroom, I think I will allow others to give the final word on what the headroom means in terms of our own constraints with the social and economic implications of what that headroom means. Please feel free to come in, all of you, and after this we will quickly wrap the panel. We have just 2 minutes to crack it.
Can I just make a 20 seconds kind of thing?
Yes.
You see, I will just refer to a point that you made, that we need to have this transition in a manner where the communities and job losses, etc., are addressed. See, unfortunately, coal mining in India has been happening for a fairly long time, done by largely PSUs. But even then, the communities in those areas are still backward. See, so between now and the transition, something more drastic needs to be done to take those communities out and put them into the mainstream. And for that, the basic funding has to come from the state governments. They have been enjoying a huge amount of royalty, which is supposed to be spent at least partly in the coalfield areas, but actually it is just a budget balancer for them. That needs to change. That needs to change.
I think what you said is absolutely fundamental, and turning the coal economy on its head really merits another conversation. But all of us will really search for where is that one example where you have a big coal mine or a big power plant, and you also have a community which is not adversely impacted. And I think the dichotomy is very obvious. We have 3 speakers still to give their last words. Anything that you would like to stress upon, Rahul, Pratyani, as we wrap up?
Yeah, Aarti, I think it's looking pretty much clear to me. I think the pace of acceleration of adoption of renewables is something that I think is likely to continue going forward. And we are the way we are seeing things is looking at the battery evolution that is likely to happen over the next 2-3 years, and almost clearly a plateauing of demand. Going forward with the battery changes, I think the pace of acceleration will only accelerate rather than be slow. And I think we are in for a big transition, and things might happen faster than many of us expect.
Got it. That's a nice one. The pace of acceleration will only accelerate. I've heard about giving momentum to momentum of change, and this is a second one on that. Govind, what final word on how everything is coming together for you?
We see a significant interest in financing. While we said that on the coal side there was not much interest in financing, certainly energy efficiency, construction of buildings which are more green, waste to energy, and so on. So I think that on a more positive note, to the extent that efficiencies can be generated by simply improving the manner in which the current industrial structure operates, and to that extent the pressure is, let's say, reduced on the amount of energy that needs to be produced by coal, I think that there we are beginning to see a lot of funding sort of willing to come in, and in fact almost there in the next 2 or 3 years we should see a lot of that.
Fair enough. I think Taken and Rahul Tongia also said the whole thing on efficiency really needs a stress. Tim, you didn't get a chance, 30 seconds, lot of pressure, quickly.
I'll finish by saying I think global and domestic capital is virtually unlimited for renewable energy, and India has the best resources in the world and should leverage that massive opportunity to the benefit of India and the benefit of the people, and to drive deflation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, all the panelists. I know just now, we will have to end. So I thank everyone for joining, all the speakers. I request the participants to stay on, please, and Economic Times team will come back. The second part of this conference is a panel which will look at the future of renewables and also the interlinkages of renewables and integration into India's grid, and a lot of issues that Vibhuti Garg of IEFI and IIST will address. But thanks very much to all the panelists here for joining me this morning. Thanks once again. Bye.